I run a project called Replenish Oxfordshire, which is a project run by Community Action Group Oxfordshire. It's funded by Oxfordshire County Council. I have a website and I produce a monthly newsletter and blog posts around supporting people to cook and grow nutritious food with as little waste as possible. And a big element of that is, getting people to compost at home as much as possible. Okay. So just in terms of what we're going to talk about today, we'll have a quick look at the benefits of composting, sorry, every time I click on my screen, it's doing that. How composting works, different types of composting, and then any different methods and containers you can use, and any questions and answers. Great. Sorry, there we go. So as is similar to kind of all forms of waste, it's very similar for food waste as well, in that ideally we want to reduce food waste as much as possible. So I also go around the county doing different talks and workshops to reduce food waste. So things like teaching people preservation skills, fermentation of vegetables into things like sauerkraut or kimchi, workshops around cooking from scratch, cooking on a budget, and cooking with zero waste. So reducing as much food waste as possible is kind of the first step. But there are obviously some things that are entirely inedible, things like tea bags, eggshells, and those things we can compost to put the nutrition back into the soil and keep it locally. And then if you've sort of exhausted all composting efforts, or composting you decided isn't for you, then we do have excellent food recycling options within Oxfordshire via the curbside programme, which I can talk more about if you would like to hear about that. But yeah, so ideally reducing and composting are the first steps. So what is composting? Composting is essentially taking any organic matter, so anything essentially that was alive can be composted, and then those items are digested by various living creatures, both sort of micro and macro organisms, bacteria, fungi, worms, and the end result is sort of a soil-like substance that we call compost, and it's full of life. They have a complete ecosystem in your compost heaps, and it's fantastic to sort of feed your soil and then feed your plants. As we all know, like, good soil is the key to good plants in the garden. So the benefits. So one of a key benefit for many people, but is it saves money. So if you are a gardener in any shape or form, you have a garden, then more than likely you're going to be sort of buying in compost at different times of the year, perhaps particularly when you're starting new plants or seeds in springtime. And so the more compost we can make at home, the less we need to buy it. Obviously, as I've said, we're also sort of recycling our kitchen and garden waste, keeping it in that hyper-local. Composting is essentially a perfect example of a circular system that means we sort of eat our veggies potentially from the garden, and then we're putting this food scraps back into the garden to feed the soil and grow more vegetables. So yeah, it's kind of a wonderful system and great to keep those nutrients in our soil. Composting means nutrients are more available to the plants, so they're in a form, once everything's broken down, that means they're absorbed more readily by plants, so making, again, more healthy plants. Improving the soil structure, so depending on where you are in Oxfordshire, you might have very sandy soil, it's very light and drains freely, but it doesn't necessarily retain very much water when you want it to, so adding compost will help with that. And conversely, if you're on very clay soil, as some of Oxfordshire is, then it helps break down that clay and prevent it from getting too waterlogged. So yeah, great advantage there. As I say, it contains all those beneficial organisms that mean your soil is full of life. We shouldn't be, when you buy soil, compost from garden centres, it's invariably pretty sterile. You don't see any worms in it. You don't see really any other creatures in it. So it's not as good for your soil and your plants. We want all those beneficial organisms. And of course, it's also helping the environment by reducing the amount of emissions potentially, particularly if food waste ends up in landfill. We're again very lucky in Oxfordshire that only around 3% of our waste ends up in landfill. Most of our non-recyclable waste is burnt for energy. But even then, those are you're still getting certain pollutants from that process, and even better if we can recycle it locally and avoid also all the pollution sort of involved in transporting our waste. So your creatures in your compost pile, as I've said, you've got a whole ecosystem in there. Invariably, however well or not well you're managing your compost heap, you will have some of these life forms. So the microorganisms are what kind of start off the composting process usually. So there's bacteria and fungi in there. And then at a certain stage in your composting process, your macroorganisms, so your worms, millipedes, slugs and snails will kind of move in, and all sorts of other creatures. There's things like pseudo-scorpions in there. They're fascinating to watch if you come across them. Yeah, all sorts of beasties in there that will break down the sort of tougher material in your compost pile. So we talk a little bit about aerobic versus anaerobic composting. So aerobic composting is when your material is broken down by essentially aerobic organisms, so they require oxygen. So that's why we will come on to talk a lot about getting oxygen into your compost heap. If you're doing any sort of anaerobic composting method, and there are a couple of those that I'll talk about, then you're relying on anaerobic organisms, so you're not requiring oxygen. But generally speaking, most of the composting we want to achieve at home is aerobic, and that's for a number of benefits. Firstly, it's faster. It's normally a hotter process, so that means you'll be able to compost things safely, like potentially it will kill, the heat will kill pathogens and also plant diseases and plant seeds, which obviously is beneficial if you're then using your compost on your garden. Aerobic composting will also produce carbon dioxide rather than methane, so it's not, that therefore means it's not as smelly, but it's also far better for the environment. Methane is around 20 times more sort of harmful to the environment, more polluting than carbon dioxide, so we don't want to be producing that as far as possible, which is what would normally happen if this food waste did end up in landfill, for example. Okay. So there's 3 general stages of aerobic composting. So you start, essentially, if you were to put all of your organic waste into a pile in the garden, in whatever kind of system you would like, or even just in a heap, then it will start to heat up during that initiation phase, and you'll have mesophilic organisms is the name of the organisms mostly present at that time. So bacteria, basically, that will start to generate heat. And then the compost moves into the thermophilic phase when you've got thermophilic organisms in there dominating. They're producing lots of heat, multiplying really rapidly. And that's at the time that you're going to be sanitizing and killing your seeds. So it needs to sort of be above around 60 degrees for that to be happening. And then eventually those organisms will exhaust the food that they're feeding on, and the compost heap will start to cool down again. There are ways sort of we can try and keep it hot and in that thermophilic phase for longer so that it's a faster process. But ultimately it will cool down again, and you'll begin to get more of the mesophiles working. And you'll also get those macroorganisms we talked about coming in. So things like the worms won't necessarily like the really hot phase, but they'll move in towards the maturation phase when you've got rougher material that still needs to be broken down. So that's the general sort of composting cycle. Just in terms of where you put, so if you're completely new to composting and you're thinking, where do you want to put it in your garden? Then ideally you want your, certainly if you were doing, we'll talk about the different systems, but if you were doing an open sort of pallet bay type system, or one of those Dalek bins that I'll show a picture of later, then ideally you want to site it directly onto the ground, so onto soil, onto grass, so that those macroorganisms can find their own way in rather than having it on a hard standing surface. You want a fairly sheltered location, but also ideally you want it to be have some sun, preferably, so that will help it to heat up and to stay hot. Away from fences and sheds, this has been sort of more of a concern in hotter climates than ours, but as we continue to see signs of global warming, then a compost heap, it's not impossible for a compost heap to catch a light, so it's worth keeping it away from fences and sheds for that reason, and away from trees. The other reason to keep them away from trees is obviously you're creating, if you've got free drainage underneath, you're creating a lovely environment of really good soil and compost, and you're then going to get tree roots kind of coming into that to feed off those nutrients, so you don't necessarily want that. It's great to have it fairly accessible. Mine is at the end. Most of my compost systems are at the end of quite a long garden, so that does mean I end up sort of with a bucket nearer the house, or making regular trips down to the end of the garden with food scraps, which can end up at times meaning you're less likely to do it. So you want it to be accessible, both for adding material but also for getting the compost out when it's finished. So ideally with sufficient sort of space that you can get a wheelbarrow close to it to load up, or alternately have it very close to your vegetable patch or where you're likely to use the compost. It's also good to have it somewhere that potentially you're sort of passing or approaching regularly, again to keep sort of other beasts, things like rats, away from it, by the fact that it's not sort of tucked away somewhere where they're gonna merrily feed off the waste without being disturbed. And the ideal size is around 1 meter cubed, because that's you have to have enough volume of material for it to achieve those hotter temperatures. Okay. So what do we need for composting? As I say, we need those organic materials, which I'll come on to talking a little bit more about what they are and what you can and can't include. The smaller the bits that you're putting in, the better, really. So if you are adding sort of garden waste, woody material, then it's great if you can shred it. You can also pop things out on the lawn to sort of mow over leaves, mow over woody material. If you don't have a shredder, or just chop things up as small as possible, and don't put sort of massive chunks of things in there and expect them to break down. Of course they will, but they'll just take a long time to do it. You need warmth, so as I say, good to have it at least partially in the sun if possible. You need that all-important oxygen to keep it an aerobic process, and a certain amount of water, obviously for all the beasts living in there, but I'll come on to that as well. So what can you compost? These are just examples, but as I say, virtually everything that has ever lived can be composted. But the things that we tend to associate with compost are the following. So tea and coffee grounds can go in, and tea bags, you need to be a little bit careful with. Many of the companies have got much better at having biodegradable bags, but there was a time when many of them had plastic in, or if not in the bag, then the glue that they use to seal the tea bags together contain plastics, so that many people were sort of finding tea bag skeletons in their compost a year later. So good to be cautious about those. Grass clippings are fantastic. Other forms of garden waste, so prunings, things like that, weeds, fruit and veg scraps. Hay and manure you need to be careful about. So you just need to make sure they're sort of from organic sources and not being not being treated at all with things like not pesticides, herbicides, so that they're not going to end up sort of causing you a problem further down the line. So just make sure you know the source of those materials if you're adding them. Wood ash can be composted. Shredded cardboard, leaves, shredded paper, newspaper, wood chips, straw, organic, sorry, not necessarily organic, but natural materials, so wool and cotton and eggshells I mentioned earlier. So in terms of what you can't compost, obviously things that are non-organic, so plastic, metal, glass. Meat, fish and dairy, I'll come on to which systems they're okay in. So they are okay for some systems, but for your bog standard kind of pallet bay or outdoor system, then it's best to leave them out. The same with cooked food. The reason for both of those is really that firstly, they'll end up sort of potentially smelling, but they're also going to attract other creatures, so rats, foxes, things like that. Fats and oils need to be out of pretty much all compost systems, really. They're not ideal for any compost system, but most of the Oxfordshire County, they can be collected as part of your sort of food waste service. You put them in separate bottles on top of your food waste bin, but do double check in your area. Dog poo and cat litter you don't want to put in because of potential pathogens, so avoid those. Perennial weeds, roots and weed seeds. Again, some systems will cope with those, but if in doubt, sort of leave them out. You can always, what I do is tend to sort of top those kinds of perennial weeds. So if you've got things like dandelions, you can put all the leaves safely in, but just leave that root out. And then when you're weeding annuals, just try not to be adding them to the compost when they're going to seed. Most of these plant material you just want to leave out just to try and avoid spreading it. And charcoal or coal ash shouldn't be composted. So if you've got some experience of composting or heard talks or read about it before, you'll probably have come across the carbon to nitrogen ratio, or also known as sort of greens and browns. So we need both carbon and nitrogen in our compost. The materials that are high in carbon tend to be called browns. The materials high in nitrogen are called greens, but they're not always, the color doesn't always match. So not every item that's high in carbon is necessarily brown, and not every item high in nitrogen is necessarily green. So it's kind of a more generic term. It's good to line the bottom of a new compost heap with some woody brown material. It will sort of help drainage of water away from the system as well. And then gradually add more material, ideally in alternate layers of browns and greens. And you want sort of a roughly similar volume of each. But if you're in doubt, then normally it's better to add more browns. Most people have a problem of too much green material, so too many grass clippings, for example, and not enough brown material. The other issue is that often we end up with those different materials coming at different times of the year. So we might end up with more greens in spring and summer when we're mowing the lawn, and then we'll have more brown material like autumn leaves in autumn and winter. So if you've got enough space, it's sometimes worth keeping an area for each of those materials individually, and then you can add them in layers as you gain more of those materials. There is a great website called Share Waste. It's not massively widely taken off in Oxfordshire, but obviously the more I keep telling people about it, the more I hope more people will use it. Or you might be able to just chat to neighbours. If you don't have enough of either a green or a brown material, then you could ask someone nearby if you can, perhaps you can have your neighbour's grass clippings. Or a thing I often do is we'll go out on recycling day and ask people if I can take cardboard from them. So more efficient in a way, and keeping it more local than recycling cardboard. It can go in your compost system, And again, the more of these materials you collect and rescue, the more compost you'll make. And in my experience as a gardener, I just never have enough compost. So it's my mission for next year is to try and be adding more materials from elsewhere. Okay. So just in terms of which kind of materials, which, as I say, many of the brown materials are brown, so that helps, but not all of them. So wood chip has a much higher carbon ratio. Obviously, everything organic is going to have some carbon and some nitrogen, but these are just, what's the most dominant element within them. So your wood chips have a particularly high ratio of carbon, as does shredded cardboard, shredded paper, and straw. And then on the other side for your greens, you've got vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, manure, or sort of animal manure that you can add, or vetch, which essentially legumes, peas, beans, things like that, have a high amount of nitrogen. As I say, roughly 50-50 in volume, but if in doubt, sort of generally add more browns. But we'll come on to sort of troubleshooting problems with your compost heap. How are we doing for time? 1 o'clock. Okay, we'll whiz through. So to get the mix right, if you've got too much nitrogen, then essentially your heap will then tend to become anaerobic. So more of that nitrogen generally means it's wetter. It will sort of be quite dense and start clumping together and be slow to break down. So the solution to that is to add more of that brown material and more oxygen. So turn it, poke some air holes in it, add some wood chips, scrunched up newspaper, cardboard, things like that. If it's too dry, then you've potentially got too much brown material in there or not enough green material to balance it, and it will be slow to break down. If you see ants in your pile, then that's generally a sign it's probably too dry. So again, mix in high nitrogen materials, or you might need to add water. So once you come to using your compost, then you can use it. No-dig gardening is becoming more and more popular, so you can use it for no-dig beds, laying cardboard down on a new patch of grass, for example, and then adding compost on top of that allows you to plant into that sort of base, and then you can not have to dig your soil and add more and more compost each year. You can obviously fill raised beds with it. You can use it as a mulch just on all of your garden plants. Good to do that in autumn once things start dying back, and when it's maybe you've had some rainfall, it will help keep the water in. You can feed your lawn with it, so potentially aerate your lawn with either, you can get special tools or just a garden fork, dig that into your lawn, and then sprinkle on some compost. Will do great wonders for your lawn. Or you can make like a compost tea, which is essentially adding compost to water to and you can do it via all sorts of means, but potentially also oxygenate it and then feed your plants with a kind of liquid feed. So different systems. So we've got Dalek bins. Many of you might have, so they're quite a cheap way of getting started with composting. Tends to take 6 to 12 months in a garden, in a Dalek. You can compost garden waste. You need to only add food waste really if the bottom is sealed to avoid rats, particularly cooked food waste or those meat, fish and dairy, which I would generally leave out of this kind of system. And it's good to turn them, but really those systems are almost designed not to need turning, or you can get these sort of corkscrew aerators to turn it. But if you add material into a Dalek in layers, then just end up leaving it, then it shouldn't necessarily require too much turning. The trick sometimes is to not, because the volume of your waste will shrink as it composts down to about 50%. So if you continually add to a Dalek bin, then you might take a sort of long time for the whole volume to compost. So it might be that you need to have 2 and then be able to leave 1 for a while. The intent of the sort of a hatch at the bottom is that you can take out the compost that's ready and the rest of it will sort of fall down to restart the process. But in reality, I know people sometimes struggle getting it out of those hatches. So good to have two so that you can leave one for a little bit longer. Pallet bins are fantastic, again, mostly for garden waste, but you can put sort of raw fruit and veg scraps in there. Very easy to make. Again, I would avoid sort of the cooked food waste for the same reasons of rats and what have you. And also, these systems in the UK may not get hot enough for you to put in perennial weeds and seeds. If you had enough space, a 3-bay system is great. If you haven't, then 2 is also ideal. So again, you'd sort of add material to one side, fill it up, then start adding to the other side, and then once you've left the first side for a year or so, then empty that out, and then you can turn one into the other. So that's why 3 bays is sort of ideal for that, because you can have one with fresh materials, one that's being turned, and then one with your sort of more finished material. Okay, if you do really want to compost food waste, and that's why you're here and that's what you're aiming for, then a hot bin is a great way to go. They will cost around £140, though they sort of are coming down all the time. They'll get certainly high enough in an insulated bin to 60 degrees. Will be able to kill your weed seeds, your pathogens. You can add some garden waste to them. They're mostly for food waste, but you do still need that brown material. So they normally recommend adding kind of shredded paper or wood chip to them as your brown waste, newspaper, things like that. Theoretically, they're rat proof, although I have heard of people saying rats have managed to break through. And because of the heat, they're also faster. So composting in around 3 months. Tumblers are another good one for food waste. So they won't get kind of quite as hot, and you can get sort of 2-sided systems like this one. But really for those, you need to have all the waste ready to fill it at once. So you might need to save up your food waste or your grass clippings and your wood chip, and then add those in one go, and then be turning it regularly for a few weeks, and it will become to a state where it doesn't look like food waste anymore, and then you can transfer that to a pallet or a worm bin or something like that for the process to sort of finish off, or even just use it kind of as a mulch in that state or in a trench in the garden. They can get quite heavy to turn, so some people find that to be an issue. But other than that, the rats generally obviously can't access them very easily. They won't be very interested once the food comes out of there, so they're a good option. We supported the Restore mental health charity to get one of these for their cafe, so they love it for that reason, and then they just add the food waste from the cafe to this, and then to the compost heap once rats aren't going to be interested anymore. So yeah, they're a good option for getting compost more quickly, and also avoiding rats if you're worried about them. Worm composting I absolutely love. So as I said, my compost heaps are down the bottom of the garden, but I do have a wormery near the house, so that often gets a lot of the veg scraps. You can easily make your own ones if you don't want to buy a commercial one. You can just get sort of a couple of buckets, and with lids, and drill holes in the bottom of each of them, so that they would drain, be stackable and drain into each other. You can add a tap if you want to, but you don't sort of have to. You can have the bottom one draining a bottom bucket without holes that the water drains into. Worms don't tend to like citrus or alliums, the onions and garlic, things like that. They'll tolerate it in a compost heap, in a big heap, because they can sort of move away from those materials, and you're not going to have a high concentration of them necessarily. But in a small wormery, it's best to avoid them. They're too acidic for the worms. It says, we say sort of keep indoors over winter or somewhere sheltered, like an unheated shed or greenhouse. Mine is outside all year, but I have occasionally needed to sort of insulate it with bubble wrap and things to stop them freezing during the winter. And again, you can use sort of paper, cardboard. They only really take quite small volumes is the issue with the wormery, but they do produce a really high quality compost, and also through the tap a liquid feed that's great for using as a plant feed if you dilute it. I think we're getting to the end. Bakashi, I think I'll just leave that and let people say in the chat if they have a particular interest. It's basically a sort of indoor composting system that is actually anaerobic, so different from all the rest in that it uses a bran to ferment the food waste. So it's an anaerobic process, but great for perhaps if you haven't got a garden or you're balcony gardening, you can do that one indoors. Okay, so I've got